Welcome to Antarctica Did That For Me. We're a podcast for everyday people with a little adventure in their hearts. We're Keri and Cassa, and we've spent huge chunks of our time living and working in Antarctica. Welcome to a journey that changed our lives. We hope it will change yours too. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Antarctica Did That For Me. I am your host, Keri Nelson. I'm sitting here with my lovely co-host and friend, Cassa Grant, and we are here today to talk about a subject that we refer to all the time but never define, which is, what does it mean to be Antarctican? We refer to ourselves as Antarcticans all the time, but I don't think we ever talk about what we mean when we're saying those things. Cassa, have you ever identified as an Antarctican as part of how you see yourself in the world?
Absolutely. And I think that it's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of all of the, I'm going to call them Icans, but American. I grew up in Montana. I'm a Californian. All of these things have definitely shaped who I am and how I show up in the world. So Antarctican is definitely a big part of that.
Are there any particular ways where you see that you're doing something different or being a different way because you are a changed person because you're Antarctican now?
I think that I'm probably a lot more resilient and able to cope with hard things and accepting of that than I was before I went to Antarctica, for sure.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I think a lot of people who are Antarctican would completely identify with what you just said. Like, that is something that I think I'm able to do a lot better too. It's very much a characteristic of people who have been through a little bit of a trial by fire, trial by ice. Before you went to Antarctica, when you were thinking about the people who would be there, what did you think you would find there?
Well, when I first heard about people working down there, I thought I would find a bunch of really hardcore adventurists. I don't even know if that's a word. That's probably not a word. I had an inside track because I had a friend who had gone down for years before I went down. So I thought I would find more people like him, basically. Somebody who was very creative, very entertaining, very open to experiences, and just an interesting person all around. So that was what I was hoping for. And I think that's
and did you
what
find?
I found. Yes, definitely.
I would say that when you say those words, those are characteristic of many, if not all, of the Antarcticans who I know. Very creative, very individualistic people. I admire a lot of people there because they have those qualities. When I imagined, before having ever been to Antarctica, and I didn't know anybody there either, I thought I would just run into a bunch of rugged people who could make fire out of snowflakes if they needed to survive, who would be gruff and wouldn't want to talk to me very much, that I would be completely not the right tough kind of person that could make it into Antarctica. And I think I just drew this very aloof, individualistic person. And there are definitely people who are that way, but not all Antarcticans, right?
Absolutely not. And I think that there can be those aspects of ourselves there, but being an Antarctican is very different. And this also brings up the question of who gets to claim being an Antarctican. Do you get to claim it if you went down on a 2-day cruise? How do you decide who gets to be Antarctican?
And could somebody be Antarctican if they shared all of the sort of common values and the love for the continent, but were never able and never will be able to get there themselves? Is there room in that kind of personal mix of attitudes and outlook that could make you sort of honorary Antarctican in that way? I don't know. I think we were going to take a stab here at trying to define this a little bit. So we just kind of came up with a very hastily drawn list of some common characteristics of people we know in Antarctica, what kind of people they are and what kinds of things they share. So I'm just going to say this and have you fill in the blank, Cassa. Antarcticans are. How would you fill that sentence in?
I mean, I think that the first word that comes to mind is Antarcticans are characters. Usually there's some pretty interesting, individualistic people who, I don't think they do this on purpose, but there's kind of a legend that gets created around them, especially if they've gone down for quite a few years, or if they're in more of a public facing role. There's always going to be stories about them, and it just kind of creates this snowball effect of who they show up as on the ice.
There are some absolute legends of people who we know from our time in Antarctica. Many of them, I would say, have a lot of quirks, right? Like you could say there's a notable personality feature or ways somebody dresses or ways somebody carries themselves. There are many, many of those people in our world.
From the way that they talk on the radio to the way that they dress to the way that they show up in all hands meetings, for example. It can be quite the cast of characters. It sometimes feels like you're on a really hilarious reality TV show.
Yeah, you're right. And these are people who I will remember for the rest of my life, even if we didn't even know each other very well during the time that we spent there. They're just unforgettable people.
One of my favorite ones, I honestly, I will say, like, a lot of the ones that I think of are the fleet ops folks, so the people who work in fleet operations, and they are they operate a lot of heavy machinery, and you just hear them on the radio all the time. They're in charge of a lot, so that's probably part of it. Like, people just are around them a lot, and they hear a lot of their stuff. And there was one woman in particular who'd gone down for, I don't even know how many years, probably 30 or 40. And it was always like, oh, make sure you drive just right, because if she sees you, you're going to be really scared. You're going to be sorry. And then once I got to know her, she was my sweet mate. She's a wonderful person. But man, there was a legend around her for a while that was pretty scary my first couple of seasons.
We didn't talk about this characteristic, but I think it's very true. If I was going to have another one, Antarcticans are very tolerant of individuality because so many Antarcticans are individualistic themselves. There's a really high bar for people's quirks and just being totally cool with the quirkiness going on around you, wouldn't you say?
Yes, definitely. Absolutely.
People who would cause friction in a lot of other community settings are just not causing as much. There's still some of them causing friction, but as much friction among people on the ice, because I just feel like the people's meters are geared for a higher tolerance of that sort of thing.
Well, and I think also in a small community like that, you cannot be anonymous. And so if you want to create friction, you better back it up with, your face, your reputation, all of those things. And
that's right.
It's not as easy to do when you actually know the people and have to be around them for the next 5 months straight.
Okay, we need another word. Antarcticans are...
Well, I mentioned this before when I talked about what I expected, which was creative. And I think that creativity comes in a lot of different ways. It can be how to solve challenging problems based on a lack of materials or challenging weather events, that kind of thing. It also can just be creative in how we want to have fun, creative in the things that we want to do. There's so many different ways that creativity shows up down there. Creative in relationships, frankly, creative in the community.
Right.
I love how creative Antarcticans are.
It's inspiring, actually. I think I've learned to be a more creative person just by osmosis, by being around people who are constantly coming up with solutions or coming up with new art or coming up with whatever, new ways of even social organization. It's a really inspiring continent to be a part of. Another way I would fill in the blank of that sentence is to say that Antarcticans are, in a really surprising way to me, community builders. I mentioned that when I thought about the people I would find in Antarctica, I thought they would be so individualistic as to almost be hermit-like. That, of course, is not what we find when we go to the continent and realize that there are a ton of people there up for community connection, up for making special events happen, up for making special just ways of being together happen. And it isn't always the wash of people that you would always find. There's a lot of different perspectives that come into making those communities too. And so I think Antarctican society looks a little bit different based on the people who are arriving down there. It's just slightly different demographic than it would be from a lot of places, say in the United States.
Yeah, and I would say with that one too, it can show up in different ways, because we might think of community building as having a kapahaka event or one of the parties that different work centers will host, or doing different kinds of, and when I say kapahaka, I mean like a performance. So doing different kinds of performance type activities, that kind of thing. But I also think that there's a lot of community building going on in the workspaces as well. So the way that the community of a workspace builds itself and the way that they relate to each other is really, really fun and interesting. I've worked with people who were really delightful people who didn't go to any events at all outside of work, but who were still really essential parts of the community because of the way they showed up in their role and the way that they connected with people.
That's a great point. And not only among work centers and the people who directly all fix cars or the people who directly all deliver supplies, but the way those departments then have built ways of relating to each other. It really is how business gets done in Antarctica. It's been fun to just witness that. And I was really wrong when I thought people would only be hermit-like. In fact, people are very social in Antarctica. Antarcticans are more social than you would think, if not completely the most social people in the world. Okay, well, what else would you, if we're defining these Antarcticans, what else would you say?
I think the next one would be open to experience. These are people who, again, these are broad strokes, but I think that overall, the people who decide to pack up their lives and go to Antarctica for X amount of time are pretty open they're pretty open to trying new things, and they might not be like super duper adventurous in the ways that you might think, but they are open to a new way of being in their lives, in themselves, in how they interact with the world. And I think that that's a really cool thing that shows up in different ways down there as well. And I guess that's similar to tolerant,
Yeah.
but a little bit different in terms of just having that kind of like, what's going to happen vibe.
We're putting this proviso on that it is definitely not all Antarcticans, but I will say that of the people I know who are most adventurous in life, and that's when I think about people who are willing to go some really far-flung places with a tiny little backpack on their back, almost all of those people are Antarcticans. They've just made Antarctica as part of their adventure. And there are entire veins of people at all the different stations who are pipelines to other very adventurous jobs, islands in the middle of nowhere, or very far north jobs, or jobs on research vessels that I'd never heard of that go around constantly doing research all over the oceans of the world. Those veins of people are moving through Antarctica all the time. So yeah, it's not everybody, but there are entire communities and rivers of people living very adventurous lives in Antarctica. So to me, that is a very important quality of Antarcticans. And to be honest, adventure, even that's not even travel to different parts of the world adventure, these are people who are willing to, with their own power of their own shoulders. Our friend Galen, for example, just went and built a cabin on her own, or in the middle of nowhere, or they're willing to take, or Gracie, for example, was willing to four-wheel roller skate across the entirety of the United States. So it's people who are willing to have sort of human investment adventures too. And it's very characteristic of Antarcticans.
And so what would be the next thing on that list for you, Keri? Antarcticans are?
I mean, I think many Antarcticans are incredibly social. Again, it plays against my expectation that everybody was going to be a hermit, but people are ready for a party in Antarctica. They're ready to get together. They're ready to make special events happen. I think they have creative hopes and dreams, and they think maximally, not minimally, when it comes to those things. And so I just am always amazed by Antarcticans' propensity to be ready for a good time. I think it's very characteristic of us.
I think that it plays well into that creative spirit too, of kind of what is this going to look like and what kind of experience do we want to create for ourselves? Yes, it might be around the container of a party, for example, but it could be something like the craft fair or things like that, where basically people make a bunch of stuff and then they sell it. Because again, we don't get to shop very much down there. So people really look forward to the craft fair, and people make some amazing stuff, but that's somebody organizing that and being willing to put that out there, which is work. It's willing to work for a good time, maybe. That's how we put it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I would say, well, why don't you toss one in here? Antarcticans are...
I would say that a lot of Antarcticans, and again, this is very general, maybe would be a little more rebellious than other folks. And again, this is all very nebulous, but I would say that there
rules
a
resistant.
lot of them, yes, maybe rules resistant. They'll still follow a lot of rules, but there are certain rules that don't sit very well. And also, I think that actually also goes hand in hand with that individualistic or that character kind of thing of like,
yes.
I don't need to be told what to do. I can figure it out. And then sometimes I might be a little bit of a teenager rebel behind the gym smoking cigarettes. I mean, this is a teenager in my mind being a rebel. I might go into that kind of mode just because I'm triggered by rules or whatever. So again, I don't think that it's necessarily showing up in a lot of really unhealthy ways, but it's just this kind of sense of I do what I want as much as I can.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Well, I mean, to get to the continent in the first place, you're kind of breaking the rules of society, right? You're already willing to say, the rules say that I should be having this kind of life and ABC, and Antarctica is never in that ABC direction of how you're supposed to do life. So in some ways, you've already broken a rule to come down to the ice. And people who are willing to do that, gathered in one place, are going to be a little bit rules resistant sometimes, I think.
And then how about you? What's the next one for you?
The last thing I have to say about it really is that I think that there is a common thread of Antarcticans being environmentally conscious. And that, comes with the space that people were drawn to in the first place. It comes with being in close contact with this really gorgeous part of Earth, and feeling really personally involved in trying to do what one can to take good care of it. And so I think Antarcticans in general tend to be pretty environmentally conscious.
Yeah. And I think that it's pretty hard not to be when you're down there and the environment is such a big part of your day to day. It's about being environmentally conscious in terms of conservation, but it's also being environmentally conscious in terms of what's going on in the environment around me, right? So there's
Oh,
two
absolutely.
sides of that coin, I think. When you're down there and we see a lot of indicator species and a lot of things that are giving us very clear data about what's going on globally, it's much easier to pay attention to it and harder to not pay attention to, if that makes sense. It's very confronting.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
It matters and they're in front of you and you just want to take care of it as much as you can.
Mm.
Keep it for other people to know that it's there too.
Mm-hmm.
Constant challenge of being in Antarctica.
What does it mean to you to be Antarctican?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot about that. I think for me, when I identify who that part of myself is, I'm proud of some of those parts of myself. And it really does have to do with me being willing to take a chance to go do something that's interesting and different. When I do those things, I can think of myself as being a person who is adventurous, even though I'm living in dorms and I'm eating cafeteria food and the things don't really seem that adventurous at all. But having got out of the comfort zone of day-to-day society, that feels adventurous to me. I think I like to believe the part of me that's sort of open-minded and willing to see just some of the fun things that could be done. That was some things that were taught to me in Antarctica, and I'm Antarctican in that way. Being open to people coming and going and not needing to have exact days that things happen and exact ways that things happen, and being less rigid in my thinking and what has to happen at a certain time. Things flex and flow when you're in the Antarctica game, and you cannot be too married to the thing going a certain way. And so I think that my ability to detach myself from that necessity is something that is now Antarctican about me. How about you?
I agree. And it made me think of us, like, I was just flying back to the States last year and my flight from Auckland got canceled. So I got stuck in Auckland and people were losing it. And to be fair, they had connecting flights and other things that were happening. But I was just like, whatever, we're delayed, because I'm so used to having so many delays.
Right.
Going down to the ice or boomeranging and getting sent back, or, all of these things. It just kind of makes you go, oh yeah, well, that happened. It definitely made me be able to roll with the punches a lot more because of what you just said.
It really, really does. I think that
Yeah.
when I think about how COVID happened in the world and everybody had to start making alternate plans and things that you were used to knowing happened, they just weren't happening in that time when the world was shutting down. And of course, COVID happened to everybody in the world. So obviously to the Antarctican programs too. And I know it was a huge challenge for all of these programs, but for Antarcticans who have to just really play it by ear all the time, it almost seemed like it was just that season's big problem to solve. That sometimes it's the ice tanker won't come in and sometimes it's a pandemic, but it's just another problem to solve. But you definitely cannot be a rigid thinker who needs to have a plan and needs it to happen in a certain way. You're not going to survive that. And so I think Antarcticans in general can really flex and flow in that way, in the way that you were just talking about.
Yeah. And for me too, personally, I think that this is something I've talked about a little bit earlier, but it's kind of been that intersection between internal and external topography, and this is a very kind of esoteric way of saying it, but sometimes we kind of go on these adventures inside of ourselves too. Even though an external event can be the catalyst, Antarctica taught me just not to be so afraid of my internal topography, if that makes sense. So there were things that happened down there that I had to really confront myself about. And that had been really scary to me in the past. And as I kind of built that muscle more and more after being down there, it became a little less scary.
I love the way that you put that because it is very confronting. I think that's a really good way to put the way that the entire experience of heading down, being down there, interacting, getting work down there it'll hit you in the face at every moment. You're always in a situation where it feels just a little bit foreign and a little bit different. You have to get comfortable with that.
Yeah. And I think travel in general does that too. Travel in general really helps you understand yourself better because you are contrasting your identity. I'm an Antarctican, I'm a Montanan, I'm a Californian, with the new place that you're in. And it kind of helps you understand what you want to maintain as part of yourself and what you want to maybe let go of or adapt better to the place that you're in. And I think that's why travel is so exhilarating for people, but also so confronting as well. It's just on a different level and a different way of frequency, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I want to add one more thing into this discussion, which is I think that it's hard to be an Antarctican and not see and feel, especially when you're around the terrain and knowing where you are as a place, is that Antarctica feels like potential to me all of the time. So we get a lot of voice voices. We talk about climate change. You see the headlines. Many of the data points coming out of Antarctica are discouraging. But I think when you are on the continent, there's still so much potential there. And I think seeing the potential for us to right some of the wrongs, to do something right, we're working all the time to kind of elevate Antarctic science on behalf of humanity. I think it's hard to be an Antarctican and not see potential for the work that we're doing. And so I think that's part of what defines us too.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that you're right. There's so many things that have been developed down there that have really changed the rest of the world in ways that aren't obvious, I think, to anyone who hasn't been to Antarctica, if that makes sense. So like different ways, just technologically wise too, and for space, for all kinds of inventions. And so it's really interesting to see how that kind of trickles back out into the world.
Well, I will say that I feel so lucky and so privileged and can't even believe that I get to say that I am Antarctican, but I proudly claim the mantle now. I think for a while I wasn't sure if I could really claim it because there was always more of an explory person out there, or somebody who was more rugged out there, or somebody who had done some amount of research or had discovered some things. But I think the way I define it now, it's not true. Like, you and I are very Antarctican. The people who are working on these stations are as Antarctican as somebody who climbed the highest mountain in Antarctica. And so whatever we define it as, I know that I am proud to be Antarctican, and it's very much a part of my identity now.
I love that. You put that really well. And I think that leads really well into our penguin hop a little bit here. Our idea for something to think about at the end of each episode is thinking about the different, I'm calling them ICANN, which I know that's kind of confusing, but the different identities that you've built for yourself. So the different things that you've done, the things that places you've lived, ways that you identify as part of or belonging to, how do they shape your perspective and your experiences? I think that's really interesting to think about in many different cases. It doesn't have to just be Antarctican.
Defining these things for ourselves is important because as we come across the future things that will happen to us, knowing who we are inside at our core and what we value about those things from whatever parts of life we're getting them from. It's just really important to know those things about yourself so you can make decisions that are good for you in the future.
Agree. Thank you. Well, thanks so much for listening. And we hope this was an interesting episode. I was very interested in this episode and that it sparks some thoughts and retrospective in all of our listeners.
That's right. And I'm about to head down to this place we're talking about one more time. And I'm sure that my perception of what Antarctican is going to change in that time. But I'm absolutely on the hunt for confirming whether I'm right. I think that I'm excited to be spending some more time around Antarcticans and excited to be able to share that with you on this podcast as I learn. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Antarctica Did That For Me podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support our efforts, we would love it if you would tell your friends. And if you leave us a review on Spotify or Apple, it will help us find more of our fellow adventurers. We are on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and more, or find everything, including links to our social media at antarcticadidthatforme.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep thinking about what Antarctica could do for you.